Hi, and welcome to this live conversation. We're thrilled to be talking about documentaries today, and we've got three great documentary directors with us, and they've all had an episode on the podcast. Up top, we've got Alexander Nanau. He's done Toto and His Sisters and Collective, and he's on Season 1, Episode 140. We've got Matthew Heineman. He's done The First Wave and Retrograde, and he's Season 2, Episode 10, and Alex Pritz, who's done My Dear Kyrgyzstan and The Territory, and he's Season 2, Episode 9. So guys, thank you for coming and being here with us.
Yeah, great to see you all.
Yeah.
Great to see you all. I think we should start off by asking, what is a documentary?
What is it to you?
What to you is documentary? Matt, you start.
Wow.
Put you on the spot.
You were out of the room when we decided what the first question would be. Sorry.
A light little question here.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of documentary film is such a malleable form. You know, if you even just look at the 5, nominated films this year, it's such a range of styles and approaches. I think the three of us on this Zoom, approach film in a very particular way. I think we make character driven, some would call it cinema verite films, following life as it unfolds. But even just looking at the nominees, there's animated films, there's archival films. There's just such a incredible range of in which you can make documentaries these days. But I think I'm drawn to a particular type of making, a particular way of making documentaries.
Yeah.
Which is, explain.
Well, he just did.
Yeah.
Right. So what about you? Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, Alexander, how would you say? What would you say, I should say?
I think it interrupted a bit.
How would you define documentaries?
I mean, what Matt said is basically, because for me, I think docs are such a personal thing, and I think more and more people discover it as a very personal way of storytelling and of experiencing the world. And we see this boom of documentaries in the last years because people discover this, way of looking at the world. But I mean, for us makers, I think it's also a very personal decision of, how we would use cinema to explore the world or tell stories. And I came to it, for example, I fell in love with, British documentary films from the 40s and 50s. And then at a certain point, I would discover Weissman and the Maisel brothers when sitting in a cinema in film school where I was studying basically fiction filmmaking. I thought, wow, there is really a way to let and make real life people look bigger than life. Like normal people can work, and you can identify with normal people in the same way we're used to do it with stars or with actors. And from then on, it was really a decision to explore the world through a lens and understand the world through documentary filmmaking. So that's what it is for me.
And Alex, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of use the terms documentary and nonfiction film interchangeably. Like, I think there's been a bit of a shift I see in documentary, kind of moving from more journalistic work, centered around the idea of objectivity, into more subjective versions of documentary, saying, this is my experience of the world internally. How can I portray that in a way that, you might understand it and see how it overlaps with your subjective experience of the world. But I think at the kernel of it, for me at least, it does need to be based on a non-fictionalized version of events that really did happen, and we have to have some kind of agreement about what that looks like. But that's also up for debate. I think there's the genre of documentary film almost shouldn't even be a genre anymore. I think there are archival documentaries, there's Western documentaries, there's verite character-driven documentaries, there's dream memory sequence documentary. There's so many different types that it's a really big discussion, I think.
So how would you feel, just while you're talking about that, Alex, how do you feel about a film, say, like Robert Flaherty's film A Man of Arran, which is a documentary set on the Isle of Arran about these men going out shark fishing in small rowing boats? But apparently they never did that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Mark Greco's film, A River Below, in which he follows, an environmentalist TV presenter who's trying to demonstrate to the world the horrors of pink river dolphins being massacred. Right. And so he nudges an indigenous community to commit one of these acts, on film in order to demonstrate to the world. And it's part of this bigger purpose. And it really does happen all the time. That's true. But this instance that he captured, he had a really heavy hand in manipulating. And when that came to light, it shattered his entire reputation and his show and everything. And so A River Below was this wonderful documentary about that process of image making and, truth construction. And everybody has different practices, I think. For me, part of it is just being upfront about it. And, if you are going to be stepping in and, recreating things or manipulating things or asking things to happen again, that is somehow reflected in the film itself, and that the audience is able to decipher that from the film itself. The film has to be credible, in my mind, as a piece of work.
I think that's a really good point, because I think in a way, for me, if I'm watching a documentary, I feel like the person who made the documentary is telling me this really happened, because it is a documentary. So if I find out later that or during it, if I suddenly get the suspicion that this is scripted, then I do have a problem. I think, well, it's okay if it's scripted, but then don't tell me I guess to me, documentary means something that actually happened.
But then,
and I don't think. Sorry, go ahead, Roger.
No, I just wanted to interject there. How do you feel, talking to you, Alex, still about your film in the Amazon? How did you feel your presence altered what was actually happening? How can you always know that everything that is happening would have happened without your presence? It's like the old particle physics question,
and
really. Isn't it?
That movie is Territory. Go ahead.
Yeah, the observer and the observed. I mean, what effect do you have?
I think, I certainly had an effect. I was an outsider, I was coming in with a camera. People behave totally differently when a camera is there. And I guess when I say that, it should be acknowledged, I don't mean, you need to have a title card at the top that says this film was shot in this way or something. I hope that when people watch The Territory, the camera itself becomes part of the story, and you see the camera being used as a tool. And so that is, an implicit acknowledgement of the fact that we helped this community use cameras in new ways, and their logo is at the front of the film, the indigenous community. And so there are clues for the audience that this film was made in a way where maybe it wasn't a strictly passive experience of the director being there standing on the sidelines. And there are ways you can do that, I think, just in the way that you're shooting too. A friend of mine talks about the credibility of a shot, and the longer you hold a shot in documentary film, the more credible it becomes, because audiences are trained to know, okay, a cut is happening. That means that something happened. They changed angles. They're moving through time, and so the longer I can hold takes as I'm shooting, the more credible I think the film itself becomes in a sense for the audience.
Alexander, same sort of point to you. I mean, you've also given your subjects a camera to get certain scenes, and the way I talk about collective, the way you followed your subject there, how did you feel that relationship evolved, and how much do you think your presence affected the way either the reporter or the Minister of Health was relating in front of you?
I think your presence always alters basically what is happening, right? With or without a camera. Whenever you go into a room, you change basically how people react or the relational behavior. But at the same time, I don't think that what we do and what we put out into the world after an editing process is saying that's exactly how things happened. It is more, this is exactly how, this is an authentic representation of what happened, right? It still is a representation of it. It's not scripted, and it's not represented through actors, or represented through what we thought would represent a certain emotion, but it's still a representation in the end, right? Because you alter reality by your presence and by the way you choose to shoot it, right? Two people would shoot the same situation so differently that you can be affected totally differently, right? One might choose to shoot it wide and keep you always aware, or with a boom in the image, and keep you always aware you're watching something, right? You're watching life evolving, right? And other people might choose to shoot a close-up of the same thing, and make you forget you're watching a documentary and try to make you identify with a character. So it's always a representation, basically, of the way the one who shoots also, decides to translate the what he's seeing into images. And when I think back to different situations, for sure, once you start to shoot with someone like the reporters, the journalists, it becomes more or less a thing you do together, right? So they are aware you're filming, right? And there are grown-ups that are also public, in the public a lot, and are trying to control their image, and then you just hope that they will be under so much stress, which also happened, that they cannot take care anymore of controlling the image. But at the same time, I had situations where I would meet whistleblowers that just came in. I just met them, and in 1 minute I had to explain, and they would say yes or no, and then we start shooting. That changes, because they are so nervous that they are really blowing the whistle at night to journalists, that it's hard to say anymore, how much do they control, how much are they influenced by my presence, or I think the most important thing is what comes out in the end, and how truthful you are to the representation of what really happened.
I want to quote Ricky Leacock here said, we're only successful in finding out anything when we're filming somebody who is more concerned with what he is doing than the fact that we're there filming them. Matt, when I read that sort of quote, I kind of think of the situations you put yourself in, which are being kind of extremely dangerous, and you can't imagine that your subjects are really conscious of
the camera,
of you being there, other than maybe thinking that you might be shot along with them. I mean, another quote, D.A. Pennybaker, you don't necessarily need a script or actors to tell a compelling tale. Finding a person at a key moment in his life and rendering the truth as you see it, that's the truest form of drama. So is that what you're doing? The kind of subjects you choose are kind of very compelling, but a film like you follow something, you don't script it. How do you judge what you're going to get from that film? Why do you choose the subject, and how do you judge what the final film's going to be? Or don't you?
No, I mean, I think that's, when I didn't go to film school. I have no formal training or background. and I just sort of stumbled into it after college. And there's a few documentaries that I saw that really sort of altered my view of what documentaries could do or could be. There's a film called Murder Ball that I saw right after school that it's a classic sort of hero, villain, antagonist, protagonist, 3-act structure, characters that pop off the screen. It was as exciting as any narrative film I'd ever seen. And it really sort of changed my view of what documentaries could be or could feel like. And that's certainly what I've tried to do in my career, is trying to make films that feel as exciting as narrative films. They I try to make them look good and feel good and sound good, and find subjects at the center of them that, as Alex said, and as you just noted, like are as interesting as any Hollywood star. I think the key for me, going back to the Leacock quote, is there's this term in documentaries, it's used way too often with this type of filmmaking, which is fly on the wall filmmaking. And no offense to flies, but flies aren't necessarily interacting with the environment they're sitting in, and a huge part of what we do and what I do is participatory. Even though in my films you never see me, you never hear me, occasionally you'll feel my presence. Like in Retrograde, there's a moment when we're General Sadat, the Afghan general that I was following, we were standing on a wall and the Taliban was encroaching, and a sniper bullet goes over our heads, and he's like, get down, get down, get down. That's one of the 2 acknowledgments in the film that I'm behind the camera. But the goal for me is to become part of the fabric of the daily lives of your subjects or your participants. So you're not helicoptering in for 2 hours and saying, can I hang out with you? You're not coming in for a soundbite. You're not coming in with a preordained notion of what you want out of the story. You are spending days, weeks, months gaining the trust of your subjects, allowing them to feel comfortable with you, so that by the end of shooting Retrograde, there's a system. Every time we got in the car, I would get in the back left, he would get in the back right, bodyguard driving, gunman in the front right. There's just the sort of rhythm that happens in the sort of daily machinations of shooting that I think allow you to get those really honest moments. And I'm shooting often 18 hours a day. I'm shooting from when I wake up in the morning to when I go to bed at night. And I try to not interact as much as possible outside of the lens, because I really want my subjects to feel like they know me through the lens. And obviously I have a relationship with them, and obviously outside of when we're rolling, there's tons of discussions of like, what's happening next, where are we going, the basic things that we need to understand and how to produce the moment. But yeah, the goal is for me, and I say this every day in the edit room, is let's let the audience feel what it felt like to be in a Black Hawk helicopter being shot at by the Taliban, to be in a COVID hospital, in the madness of it all in March of 2020 in New York. I want you to feel like what it to be like in those rooms, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get a greater understanding of these very deep, complicated issues.
So there are also documentaries where the filmmaker is asking all the questions, and so becomes, I guess, a part of the film. Do you feel that takes away from what you're trying to get across? Any of you?
A provocative comment from Fred Meisman.
Okay, we'll go back to comments.
Fred Meisman was like the master of cinema verite, really, you would say, right? But he said cinema verite is just a pompous French term that has absolutely no meaning as far as I'm concerned, which I thought was kind of interesting comment coming from him. But that's to your point.
Is it?
Yes, because, it's about your relationship with the subject. And in some documentary filmmakers like Dave Hancock, Herb DeJoya, who I knew very well, would talk to the subject while they were filming, and while their subject was actually doing what they had to do within their environment. So how do you feel about that sort of
But
difference.
also, I have seen documentaries where I have felt like the filmmaker is too much a part of it. In other words, I want to know what the people in front of the camera think, but the filmmaker seems to be inserting themselves. That's why I asked the
Yeah,
question.
Alex, you were doing a film where you were actually mixing those kind of relationships with the subject.
Yeah, I think, I like the quote that you had from, I can't remember who it was, about, the pompousness of cinema verite. And I think of,
Fred Wiseman, yeah.
yeah. No small guy. A friend of mine who I think, Matt, you definitely know, I imagine you know too, Alexander, Joan Churchill, who's an amazing cinematographer. And she quotes somebody who I can't remember, who says, cinema verite is about wanting what you've got, not getting what you want. And I think, I sort of balance that it's hard. I think of that when I'm a cinematographer, and all three of us are kind of documentary directors and cinematographers. And when I'm shooting, I'm very much trying to be as present as possible, as, in the flow of the moment, and not trying to overthink things, and really like dancing, choreographing myself with these people. And then you have to step off at the end of the day and put on your director hat and really anticipate, okay, big picture, what's happening? What do we need to see? What scenes do we need to be able to capture? And so, I don't think of my style as pure cinema verite in that sense. Like I do have things I want and I'm trying to get them. I'm not just kind of like moving through the world in that way, but it's a tension I feel in being both a cinematographer and a director, that you're trying to be very present in those moments, but then also trying to anticipate, these bigger things, and plan for how to be able to get them. And those can be sort of in conflict for me at times.
Do you find it is the work of being a documentary filmmaker? Is it as much about the exploration of a subject and the world as it is making the film? It certainly was for me when I was first starting shooting documentaries. It was like the first time I really traveled the world and went to places I'd never been, and learned things I hadn't learned before. Albert Maysor said, if you end up with a film you started with and you weren't listening along the way. Would you all say that's true?
Well, that's
Alexander, in particular, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's oh, sorry.
No, just Alexander, I wanted to ask actually, because it refers so much to the collective in a way, doesn't it?
Definitely, but I think that was also a very important step for me while doing the other film, Todd and His Sisters, because I would become more and more frustrated when things didn't happen, and I really didn't understand how to go on. And until I realized the only way to do it is to get out in the morning out of the car and not have any expectation, like non-expectation, like just be aware, just be connected to the characters and see where where the life goes, where it leads you to. Because if you go, I mean, doing what the three of us are doing, like observational docs, if you go in with expectations of a bigger arc of a story or where the story should go, then you're losing already. I mean, that's not how things work, because in the end, life is basically writing the scripts for our films, right? For sure, in the end we are shaping them, and we decide on what to focus on, or what kind of a greater theme or emotions we want to carve out of the footage. But the bigger script is written always by life, and I think that's also an interesting thing. The older you get and you understand, or you think you understand more how life evolves, and that you can't really plan a lot of it. I think it applies also totally to this kind of filmmaking, right? Just being aware. It's more like meditating, like focusing through your lens on different, on particular things that life brings to you in front of the camera. And then it's a struggle that Alex describes. Like at the end of the day, you think like, oh, so where did this go? Where could it go from here? What, for sure, it's a constant thing. And I always go to the editing room. I mean, like Matt, my shooting days look almost as like 16, 18 hours is the normal shooting day, but I would still try to go back to the studio or to where we build up an editing system to watch and to even try to color correct a bit just to get a sense of how what happened is translatable into cinema.
Yeah, Matt, what were you going to add on that?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
I was
Matt,
gonna
what
say-
were you going to say? Go ahead.
Sorry for the tape delay. I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize.
No,
I think the Maisels quote was something I heard Al say that when I was 21 years old. I was at some, symposium or something, and I heard him speak. If you end up with the story you started with and you weren't listening along the way, and almost religiously, I believe in that, and it's something that I've held incredibly close to my heart at every step along the way in my career, both in a macro sense in terms of what films I choose to make, what topics I choose to take on. And then as you sort of drill into each film, within each shoot day, within each hour, within each minute, within each lens choice, don't be dogmatic, be open to the story changing. And to me, that's the beauty and fun of documentaries, is going into a subject, thinking you understand what it's about, and then it ending up somewhere completely different. And that is borne out to be true with every film I've made. It always started out as one thing, and it's always ended up as something else. And to me, that's going into it with a really open mind and letting the story dictate where it's going to go. Our participants in the film are our screenwriters. They're our storytellers. They're the ones whose lives we're capturing in real time. And I've time and time again, it's proven to me the most exciting way, from my perspective, to make films, because again, stuff happens you could never expect. In CARTEL LAND, I thought I was telling a film about freedom fighters fighting up against the evil cartel, and as the weeks went on, as the months went on, power corrupts, and I ended up filming the formation of a new cartel under the auspices of these freedom fighters. And in Retrograde, my latest film, it started out as a film about Green Berets on the last U.S. deployment, and it became really a story about the final chapter of the longest war in U.S. history through the prism of an Afghan general. And sorry, I'm blabbering, but I so deeply in my core believe in that idea. And yeah.
I can
Do
say,
you?
oh, sorry.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that having shot with Matt as well, I shot on the first wave with him. It was something that I feel like I learned a lot from watching you direct that, Matt, was like, instructing everybody to remain really open and really curious. And I think it's one of the best parts of our job is that we're just professionally curious people. Like that is the strongest attribute you can have as a documentary filmmaker is a keen sense of curiosity. And the more that you decide what the story is, especially early on, the more you close yourself off to those possibilities that feel like luck and magic in the final film. Somebody watches and say, how the hell were you there when that happened? I can't believe it's so lucky. But it's really just following up on any one of those kind of fractaling branches of possibility in the moment, and then narrowing in on what it is that you want the audience to pay attention to later on, and saying, this is what's important, pay attention to this. And then, thing 3 or 4 can finally surprise you. But yeah,
And you're
definitely true of your
also
work, Matt.
when you're shooting, you're watching the characters too, and determining, how you can better bring, I would think, better bring these characters to the frame, because that's what I think makes a documentary more compelling. All the information is very important and all of that, but a documentary that has really strong characters in it is the one I think that pulls you in, right? So you've got to be looking for opportunities to show their characters as you get to know them, right?
I think it also works in a very classic way as drama works. Like we watch characters revealing themselves, right? And it also has a bit to do with what you said before, that in some documentaries you have the filmmaker in the film a lot helping the character to reveal herself or himself, right? Uh, but that's the beauty of it. I think that's the curiosity of studying people and watch how they reveal themselves. For sure, a lot through the relationship you have to that. Basically, they also reveal themselves through the same relationship as in the films where the filmmaker is more in the film. Only that we prefer to disappear so that what transpires through the lens and for the viewer is that character reveals towards the viewer, and that's where you can start identifying basically with the character. And the other thing is about what Matt and also Alex described, like listening to life or watching life has also to do, I think, with our natural way of living life as human beings. Like we try to find meaning in things that happen. So basically, if you go in and have go in with the idea that things should happen, you basically miss the whole thing about trying to understand the meaning of the things that just evolve in front of your camera, or that life is evolving in front of you. Because that's it, what we do with the camera. We just try to understand the meaning, and then I think that also goes over into the way we film, into photography, right? We try in milliseconds to decide which image represents the meaning that we think the life in front of us has. It's more like I think we're more like street photographers trying to, in an ongoing life to catch it and to catch the meaning of it. So.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So another quote here from
My goodness, you have a lot
Fred
of quotes.
Wiseman. I have a lot of quotes here. The things they say are so interesting. Fred Wiseman said, "It's always a problem to know what an image means," which is kind of what you're saying, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just the feeling you have for it.
I think I feel that in your work, Roger, quite a lot, and maybe that's the influence of your early documentary days. But in Empire of Light, one of the shots I remember the most is that light swinging, as they're banging on the door, and it almost feels like a cutaway, something you would use in a documentary. You're looking away from the action and you're saying, pay attention to this rather than what you think is the main action happening on screen. Or in like Sicario, the sort of shadows of light coming past the window dressings or whatever. And those feel like, tools of documentary perhaps in your work, but it's that same thing where you don't know exactly what that shot means, but it provides a little bit of space for us to kind of insert our own imagination or feel our own feelings in the midst of a really charged moment.
That's interesting, because I find in all three of your documentaries, you might choose quite dramatic, important subjects. Not always, but most of them are. But the most telling moments there are kind of like smaller moments with the character, and you just happen to be there, and the character's in a dilemma, especially in the collective or something. Sometimes it's just sitting with that Minister of Health while he's just kind of contemplating what next he's going to do, or it's the family in First Wave, with the guy, who might be on his deathbed or not. And it's just the quieter moments. It's not, it's not the shootout and the helicopter is fine, but I kind of seen Larry Burroughs photograph that, you know what I mean, in Vietnam. So kind of, what that is, but within the context of that drama, in a way, it's the little moments that to me shine out. Do you think you could have those little moments though without the bigger context? That's a hard one, isn't it?
Well, it's also, Alex, in your movie, the high wide shots of what was actually happening to the land also was very, very strong. And I'm sure Roger has another quote.
Actually, yes. D.A. Pennebaker, of all people, maybe, people don't really want reality. They want theatre, and that's different. Isn't that something quite strange coming from a documentary filmmaker such as D.A. Pennebaker? Or do you see your work like that, Matt? I mean, you've gone on to make a feature film. So how do you relate that to your documentary work? Is it in some sense similar? I mean, the feature was kind of a photojournalist in a war zone. It kind of had a lot of the elements of the documentaries you make.
Can you say the quote one more time?
He'd be happy to.
D.A. Pennebaker, people don't really want reality. They want theatre, and that's different.
I'd be curious the context in which he said that quote, but to me, without knowing the context, I think he's saying that.
I think he's saying they want drama.
Yeah, people want to be entertained, and that documentary. I was so lucky to actually know Penny a bit, and knew him quite well in his final years, and he was quite an amazing mentor to me, and he constantly talked about how documentaries can and should be as exciting as narrative films, and I think that's the essence of that quote.
Right.
But
is that reflected in is that reflected in the choice of subject, or could you take a very a less overtly dramatic subject like Afghanistan or COVID outbreak and make an equivalently dramatic film?
But for me, and I don't want to remotely compare myself to Penny, but that's all in choosing individual people to follow. That's all in it's the sort of dirty word that people don't like to talk about in documentaries, but casting. We're casting, we're finding people to tell our stories, and we're finding people that pop off the screen, that are complicated, that aren't black and white, that live in this sort of liminal space of reality, which is life. We're all complicated organisms meandering through this earth, and so to embrace that complexity in the creative process. But I think, going back to what you were saying before, it is those small moments within the larger context. Of course, I could go to Afghanistan and shoot a bunch of people shooting guns and blowing things up and all that, and that would be one version of the end of the war in Afghanistan. But I wanted to tell the emotional story through very specific people and feel their emotion. Going back to the first wave in the scene that you described, the moment when Ellis returns home after having COVID and being in the hospital for 3 months, that's why I love shooting films this way. I could have interviewed him for 2 hours, and he could have sat in a chair and he could have told me what it felt like to be home. But this is actually, Alex shot this, him just lying in his bed, staring up at the ceiling with his wife at the edge of his bed, and this slow tear rolling down his cheek. That moment spoke more than any words could have ever spoken about what he's feeling. Gratitude, fear of what's ahead, cannot, not believing that he's actually alive and that he's sitting in that room, the strangeness of being back at home, barely being able to relate to his daughter, that's all there on display without any words. The final image in Retrograde of the woman at the fence, as they're trying to flee, as they're trying to enter the airport and she's stuck on the outside. She writes a novella for us with her face. Fear, trepidation, anger, hope. And again, I could have interviewed her and asked her what she felt like, but to me, her face said more than words could ever say. People lie, faces don't lie. And that I've really found to be true the farther I get in my career is I just believe in holding on faces for a very long time, because I really feel like you can learn so much about both the person and the situation that they're sitting in by holding on shots, holding on reaction shots, shooting based on emotion, not based on dialogue. So sorry, I'm meandering, but
Not at all. I think you should be talking to a lot of feature film directors. They might learn something.
But that's,
Well, I
I mean,
think
Roger, because you're mentioning it now, I think that's for all three of us. I hear it was, and for many before us, it was like documentaries should be as exciting as feature films, and that was also something that drove us to, become better and better in the way we make our films. But I think that we are now at a point where a lot of people in the narrative space say to me, I wish we could do films as exciting and as immediate and as deep and as strong as documentaries. So I think we reached a point where both have to learn a lot from each other. It's not the one way anymore.
yeah, and I think the other thing I would add is that the three of us are making kind of similar types of documentaries, and a lot of that is taking some of the tools of fiction filmmaking, in terms of the drama and the types of characters that we're focused on. But documentary is such a broad category right now, and there's so many other interesting types of films that are reaching different types of people, and are perhaps much slower and less dramatic. Thinking of like this film, The Hottest August, or Hale County, This Morning, This Evening, films that are more experimental but are really pushing the boundaries of what documentary is in interesting ways. And I think it's important that we don't just, as you were saying, Alexander, like, we've hit this point where documentaries have adopted a lot of the tools of fiction filmmaking, but that we don't cross over that and become sort of self-cannibalizing and then become weaker and weaker, the way that some fiction films have become just more diluted and more predictable and more formulaic. And so it's a balancing act, I think, within the industry, but we're all making kind of similar types of films, and there's a lot of other types of documentaries out there too.
Yeah, just today I read. Oh, sorry. We have a delay between the continents.
Yeah, well,
Somebody speak.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Alex.
Today I just read a really interesting interview between Claire Denis and Alice Diop on her film Saint-Omer, where they really talk about this thing, like what's the difference between documentary and fiction, and what would have happened if she would have made a documentary about a trial that is in Saint-Omer. And I think Saint-Omer also, I rewatched it then this morning. I think it's just one of the strongest examples of someone going from documentary to fiction. It's incredible. So I think it's a really interesting thing to study, how someone took a real life situation that you followed in court and then transformed it into fiction, and how strong it can be, basically. And understand, I mean, even I think it's for everyone, it's just right now it's hard to understand, what is making the one thing so strong and the other weak. And Claire Denis, for example, says if you would have made a doc about the trial that you followed, people would watch the trial, analyze while they watch, right? But only because you made fiction, people can identify, and it has this magic of that happens with interpretation of something, where you identify as a viewer.
yeah. There's also that example of a film, Argentina, 1985. I suppose that's kind of almost equivalent. I mean, you couldn't have, well, nobody did make a documentary at the time, but the film almost
I think there
serves
is
as a
one.
documentary. Is there?
I heard there is one, and it's not bad at all. I think it was now at the Berlinale.
Oh wow! Oh wow! I have to see that. But the feature film it almost plays like a documentary, and in a way that's its strength, because it. But how much do you rely on the cutting room to bring drama or truth to your documentaries?
I would think drama, you'd rely a lot on the cutting room.
Matt?
You keep throwing me in there first.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Right. The tough questions.
I mean, the cliche thing that people say, which I think is absolute bullshit. Sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on YouTube, but is feature films are made in in the script, and documentaries are made in the edit room. I don't think either of those are actually true, having made both. But certainly, in the I can't speak for the Alexes, but I think for me, most of my films are generally around 1,500 hours, 1,400 hours, 1,600 hours of footage that you're distilling down to 90 minutes. So it's 1,000 different filmmakers would make 1,000 different films with that
Right.
material, and so a huge part, obviously, of the final product is created in the edit room, is distilled in the edit room. That's not to say, and I think as at least speaking for myself, as I've gotten older and older, I've been way more concentrated on what I'm shooting and how I'm shooting, even though I'm still shooting a lot, but understanding what I'm shooting for and to what end, and having the confidence to really pursue an idea. In the first wave, for example, I think a younger version of myself would have shot a lot more characters, not having the confidence that where their stories would go. But we were very concentrated on the people that we were following. But certainly, yeah, in the edit room, so much of the story is constructed and felt. And the way I always work is I cut my best scenes first. If there's 10 great scenes, I cut them first, and then basically construct a movie around those scenes, and trying to figure out how to sew them together, because I love watching scene-based documentaries where you feel like you're in the room, that you're with the subject, with the characters, that you're not being told to feel something, you're actually feeling it yourself. And so that's generally where I start. I write a treatment after I cut those scenes. By the time we're done shooting, I probably have treatment number 59, because we've evolved and changed so many times, but it's always based on wrapping it around your strongest verite scenes, for me.
Do you guys agree?
Alex,
No, you go.
Somebody go.
I think that editing, I edit actually while I'm so I edit in my head. So when I shoot a scene, that's the first thing where editing interferes, because I really, it's almost like, you live in different heads, right? You have your emotional connection, you have your metaphysical connection where you try to understand the meaning of it, but then you have this machine in your head that really tries to see, like, 1 minute went on. So what's the drama here? Who is leading? Who is the powerful in the room? What's the relationship? How do I have to cover it? What would be the best way to cover it so that you can feel it? How can I move without them realizing it? But how would I then edit, basically? So editing is part of this whole thing that happens to you while you're shooting. And then, like Matt, I for sure start with the best scenes. And that said, when we say, we rely on editing for the drama to it sounds like we work to obtain an effect that we want. I think editing is more like discovering the meaning of the whole thing. Like that's why it's so hard, because it also takes me a long time until I can really forget what I've seen when I've shot the film, and then rediscover actually what the whole thing means in the editing room. And I think that's also why it takes so long for us to edit. For me, at least.
Yeah, I find editing really hard. For me, it's by far the hardest part of the process, and it's so exciting in the beginning when you're it's all ideas, and you're coming off the shoot, and it's index cards, and then as soon as I get into the footage, it starts to feel really overwhelming very, very quickly for me, and I just it becomes this process of just cutting one. I work in a sort of a scene-based way too. but just trying to get as many of these things out. And then same sort of style where, I'll have some scenes that I know I want to work and land a certain way. They're very pointed in their direction. And then it's trying to figure out how to lead up to those, how to anticipate those, and trying to find, connections, which is really, the editor's strength is seeing these minor things that can create connections between Act 1 and 3, or, the beginning and the ending, and all of these tiny minutia that you might have glazed over in actual production that can come back and create a full tapestry out of something that might otherwise just be a sort of linear structure. I don't know if that makes sense.
And you also, while you're shooting, you take a lot of cutaways, right? I mean, I remember those insects and everything that you had taken while you were doing this much bigger story, but you ended up using those shots so well in telling the stories.
Yeah, was that an early idea?
Yeah, so, a lot of the cinematography in the territory, we thought about shapes, we thought about geometry, we thought about the geometry of the forest versus the geometry of a city. How do those feel different, and how are they visual representations of, the underlying ideology of people living in this capitalist system versus people living off of the land and the cycles of the forest. And how does that represent their views on private property? All of these things were ideas that we were thinking about as we were shooting. And, a lot of that is really hard to incorporate in. It gets left by the wayside when you're shooting a verite scene or something like that. And so we kind of went back towards the end of production and said, okay, how can we capture these big abstract ideas, in something as small as ants or something as big and wide as satellite imagery. But yeah, a lot of that early thinking and early conversations, life happened in the middle, and then we went back pretty close to the end and found a way to weave it in.
But I think to sort of what Alexander was saying, that's one of the benefits of both being a director and a shooter and an editor, is that so often when we're shooting, we are editing. I know, okay, I've got my master, I got my tights. Okay, I'm not feeling this person's reaction. You're moving around the room knowing how you're going to eventually cut it, and oftentimes, there's sometimes you're waiting for that moment and you don't know if that moment's ever going to happen. Sometimes you wait for that moment for days or hours. But then sometimes you're shooting a scene and you are 100% sure that it's going to make it in the film. And that's, to me, when I feel the most pressure. I made a film called City of Ghosts, and it's about a group of Syrian activists who stood up against ISIS. And on one level, it's about that. On one level, it's an immigration story about them, finding safety in Germany. It's a story about brotherhood. It's a story about many things, but it's also a story about trauma and the cumulative effects of trauma. And at the end of the film, when Aziz, the head of this group, comes home after there's an ISIS threat against him in Germany, and the sort of German FBI tells him that he should go into hiding because he's going to get killed. I come home with him, and in other circumstances, I could have just stopped filming, and that was an amazing scene. But I kept going. I went home with him, and I stayed with him, and he started looking at photos of his friends, and he had this, nervous breakdown on camera. And obviously, it was an incredibly difficult thing to witness. I'd grown quite close to him, and the human being inside of me wanted to stop and give him a hug, but I knew, that we had built so long to this moment, and that this element of trauma was so important to capture because it was so intrinsically. He was holding that trauma inside for the whole year that we were filming it. I'd never seen that side of him, and suddenly it was coming out of him. And so I knew in that moment that I had to capture it, that I had to, that this would likely be the final scene in the movie, which it ended up being.
But does it make you feel at all voyeuristic? Because I know you have to do it, but do you feel like, this should be private to this guy? Or are you just so into the movie at that point?
I think if I just I think that's what goes back to what we were discussing earlier. If I just met Aziz, a day earlier, and I just, of course, that would be incredibly inappropriate. But we had developed such a deep rapport over these months, almost a year of filming, that he didn't ask me to leave. I was there in some sense, perhaps a comforting presence, albeit behind the camera. And then that ended up being literally a 90-minute oneer that we ended up cutting up. Like, it was a really long take that I never cut for. And then once the sort of energy of the scene subsided, I put the camera down. I gave him a huge hug. We went out and grabbed food. We stayed up all night and talked about what happened. But I let the scene play out for a very long time until the sort of denouement of the scene, and then sort of put the camera down and gave him a hug afterwards. But of course, those are the deeply complex moral, quagmires that we often find ourselves in. This sort of razor thin line between exploitation and authenticity, between truth and our own perception of truth, and what is truth. What is the truth of the moment? And it goes back to the quote from Wiseman earlier.
Roger, are you looking for a quote now?
No.
Yeah, it must be difficult, though, sometimes to be in a situation where if you weren't behind a camera, you would walk out of the room or give the person a little bit of space. But because you have a responsibility to the documentary, you have to put it on film.
Okay.
And to him.
Go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, and to Aziz, I felt the responsibility to him to tell his story, and he was grateful ultimately that I did capture that moment.
I think Roger's dying to bring in a quote.
No, it was just Fred Wiseman. I always go back to Fred Wiseman, But the editing process, you have to edit the material. That assumes that some kind of mind is operating in relationship to the material. Not all minds are the same. Every aspect of filmmaking requires choice, which is exactly what you were all saying. It's where you position the camera. I mean, it's what when you turn the camera on, and then it's what you do with it afterwards. So really, what you're all saying is truth is actual personal perception. Each of us would shoot the truth or shoot what was reality in a different way, and we would edit in a different way. We would choose different moments to capture and to end in the edit.
But I guess that's also why, as a documentary filmmaker, you really have to edit it, because you've shot it and had your viewpoint, and you've got to continue it into the cutting room, I would think, rather than hand it over to someone else.
Yeah, I think that relationship is the most difficult one for me. Not difficult in a bad way, but just the most challenging one between director and editor, because it is such an act of trust to have somebody else take over this thing that could go in any one direction. You really have to know that you both are seeing this story the same way. But sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Matt, sorry.
Oh.
No.
I thought you were going to say something, Matt. No?
I mean, I was going to say earlier, I think obviously truth is so subjective, and any filmmaker who says they've captured the truth, are kidding themselves. I mean, every time, this, every time you change a focal, a lens, or you reframe, that's entering subjectivity into the process. Anytime you press a button in the edit room, you're injecting subjectivity into the process. So these are deeply subjective, processes that we're undergoing, sometimes in a macro sense and in a micro sense. I think for me, I'm seeking an emotional truth. I'm seeking a truth that, I say this hourly in the edit room. I want the audience to feel like what it felt like to be in those rooms. If we remotely achieve that in the edit room, then we're succeeding. When you go on a date, whether that date felt good. When you go back and see your family, there's a feeling that you have. Like, that feeling is clear. The details.
But there's also there's like a point of view in that too. Like, who do you want them to identify with in that room? Like when the Afghan soldiers are leaving, you know, there's two very different experiences of being in that room. And so you're also making a subjective decision about who you want the audience to be kind of identifying with at different moments in that even.
True.
1,000%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, one more.
But
Fred Wiseman again. I think I have an obligation to the people who have consented to be in the film to make a film that is fair to their experience. I want to ask you, Alexander, how do you relate to the subjects of your films? Because I'm thinking in particular of Toto and his sisters. How did you relate to them during the cutting process and when you were finishing the film? How did you feel your responsibility to that group was, that family?
I mean, that's a, you know, it's a very complex situation you're in, because it's true that you have to be basically, you're responsible towards them. At the same time, you are the one that, as Matt also said, you know, what you see on faces, what you see in the editing room goes so much deeper than what you experience on the set. And image doesn't lie. So many times, even emotions that you felt on the set, you realize in the editing room they were played by the characters.
That's interesting.
And so you start basically to really discover characters in the editing room and to understand these people deeper than their own mothers understand them sometimes, you know. And so then you start basically to see like what is the character I bring on the canvas. And there's always a very interesting point that is very fragile the moment the people you film see themselves, because they see basically your interpretation of themselves, right? And it might not always be the way they saw themselves. And that can also be psychologically a pretty tough moment for people once to see themselves revealed in a way that they may not have seen themselves so far. Then if the film is also successful, they share basically this image of self with a very wide audience. So that's a whole very interesting topic that appears every time you finish a film and it goes out into the world. But I always feel that, or I try at least to be truthful to what they are or what I understood about them, and also feel at the same time the responsibility that they invested me also with, that we will bring into the world a story that is really revealing of some truths about life, and that can become cathartic also for the viewer. And for that, I really feel the responsibility to be as authentic as I can once I understand a character, because I also have the responsibility towards the viewer. I mean, because you brought up Toto, I think it's interesting because during the editing time, Toto and his sister Andrea grew again a bit apart, right, or more apart. And then the first people I watched it with was the two of them, Toto and Andrea. Only the three of us in the room. And they had a good laugh, they cried, and they rediscovered how much they love each other through the film. From that moment on, they moved together, they still live together. So the film can also have this cathartic moment, but at the same time, I had also situations where, I don't know, the film was playing in a festival and an important narrative director in Germany was the head of the jury, and he fought with the whole jury for a whole night because his impression was that when you see something like that, you are not allowed to make a film about it. You have to put down the camera and only become these people's caregiver.
Wow. That's interesting.
So opinions are very different on.
Yeah.
And now we're back to the first question: what is documentary? You know, are we allowed to do it or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a situation I think it was the last documentary I worked on with a friend. We made it in a psychiatric hospital, and we followed these patients through their treatment. We chose 8 different patients that ranged from full serious schizophrenics to a German lady who had fled the war as a young child and escaped literally in a barrel in a steamer crossing the channel. And we got to know these patients so well that the psychiatrists that were in charge of them and, overseeing their care, they learned more about their lives in the couple of months we were in that facility than they had in the years these people had been under care. But the sad thing was, for me as a filmmaker, the sad thing was that we had allowed the hospital censorship on who we could or could not use in our film. So 3 of the best, the most revealing cases to me, it was deemed we couldn't put them in the film because it would have such an adverse effect on those people if they were to see the film, which I can totally appreciate, but it really kind of sometimes hurts when you think this moment is so strong. But on the other hand, when we were filming one particular patient, my friend John Sanders, who was doing sound and co-directing it kind of thing, wanted to film this particular patient in agony. She had left the hospital, she was at home, and she was a total wreck, drunk and a mess. He wanted to film her, and I couldn't. I couldn't film her. I had to clean her up, and we made her a meal, and then sat her down and filmed her, which didn't make any sense at all because you got no understanding of what was going on. But it's a very difficult problem, isn't it?
Yeah, but in the end, I think it's really it really comes down to your own moral values.
Yeah.
And there is I don't think that it's something that can be regulated, right? It's really, it has to be your own moral judgment about what you can really put on screen about someone, and if it will be basically hurtful to that person, or if it will affect his life or her life in a negative way.
I'll go back to what we were asking earlier. How much is what you do something that's personal for your own experience, or are you making films? Do you think your films have an effect on society? Big
probably
question.
Hope.
Alexandra, I don't want to ask Matt straight away because we kept putting him on the spot.
I think films the films like any other film can have effects on individuals, because when we say effects on a society, it would mean, can films start a revolution basically, or a change, or there were documentary films that changed things. I mean, even with Collective, there was a strange thing, which was, I think, in Mongolia. They showed the film, and the next day journalists basically united on social media about a patient and how the patient was treated during COVID in the hospital the next day, right after the film was premiering on private TV in Mongolia. And it toppled the government, which was like, it never happened in Mongolia. The government was it's almost a dictatorship basically.
Well, and Alex, your film was about the rainforests and everything, so one would hope it affected some people, but do you think it did?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between what you can hope to achieve and especially what you can talk about in production. Like, I'm very wary of overstating what the potential impact of a film will be to the people who we might be filming, because you don't want any false promises there. But then once it's out, especially if it's something that you care about, I think it's really exciting for me. I don't think anybody has a duty necessarily to do it, but I find it really exciting to try to find ways to have the film, actively be part of the conversations that are happening. I sort of see it as like there's the broad sense of what we're talking about culturally, what the zeitgeist is, what Congress people are interested in moving on. And I think the film, any given film, can help contribute to the types of conversations we're having as a society. But then I think in a really concrete way for all of the participants and characters in our films, the film can be a life-changing thing. I know with our film, we're working with the Uruguay, the indigenous community in our film, to help them build a media center. They took over filming as part of the production of our film. They're interested in continuing to film. Our protagonist is going to university for journalism now, for filmmaking.
That's
and
great.
So helping them get, editing facilities and that sort of stuff is the type of thing I'm interested in and excited about. But that's very localized. That's thinking about this particular community that took part in the film, and not making any huge overstating our ability to make actual change as filmmakers. There's a real role for politicians and people whose entire job it is to enact change as well.
Well, how do you think you can pressure politicians and society to change? Because on page whatever it was, 6 or something of the New York Times the other day, right at the bottom, it said the destruction of the rainforest last February was a record.
Yeah,
that's with the change of government and everything. So, and that's like a tiny little column in a newspaper that not many people read unless they're liberals.
it's hard because we talk about kind of awareness as a thing that films help raise, but especially when it comes to climate change, we've known about this since the 70s. Like, this is not new information. The rainforest has been chopped down. After we finished the territory and we sold it to National Geographic, we said, hey, let's go back and see, Nat Geo has been covering the rainforest for a long time. We found this amazing issue, 1988 National Geographic cover story about the Uruguay, this indigenous community of 150 people, and interviewing the settlers who were invading their territory back in 1988, 50 years ago now, nearly, or 40 years ago. And it was the exact same story. You could have pulled any quote from Sergio or Martins or these settlers in our film and supplanted it with a quote in this article. And it was depressing, honestly speaking, that this is still going on in the exact same way. But yeah, I think, the film, I have seen the way that the territory has convened politicians and business leaders. There was a piece of legislation that we really pressured the EU to help pass. A member of the Uruguay flew to Brussels, screened the film, had breakfast with these members of parliament, and a bill got passed which bans the import of beef and soy and leather that come from deforested areas in the Amazon. But these are such big, corruption, climate change. There's such massive issues that it is easy to feel like we're kind of nipping at the edges of them.
That's why I say, well, how much enjoyment or how much is it a personal life satisfaction working in the field of documentary and exploring the world? My years doing it, that's what it was for me, as much as it was making images and telling stories. It was experiencing kind of different aspects of life, really.
I think that, as with every art form, it is the same satisfaction of showing the things that people would not see without you.
Yeah.
That's the satisfaction of it.
Nice way of putting it.
But I don't think that, or I think if people do it with the idea of educating or of, I'll show something that will really change. I think that's that's already where, perverting art into a propaganda tool. So the satisfaction is there, like in every art form. Like you really, it's a satisfaction of discovering something because you have looked into a certain thing. But not I wouldn't say that there's a satisfaction in or a thought about, oh, this will change things. And that's a thing that I had, for example, with Collective, where even characters told me like, oh, it takes you so long. When you will be ready, the thing will not, nobody would care anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that stories, if you reach and are lucky to get to a point where they become universal, they should stay valid no matter what the outer circumstances are, because we're trying to say something about ourselves, basically. We do the films, but I think that we are so much, whatever we tell in films of other people's lives, it resonates so much with our own human little struggles, that's the story, basically, our own little human questions we have every morning. We wake up like, why are we going on? How do we survive?
Matt, what would you say?
I mean, this is something that I think about all the time, and
Yeah.
as I think we all do. Does what we do make a difference? What is making a difference? Does any of this matter? Does anyone care? In some weird way, when I made A Private War, my narrative film about Marie Colvin, the journalist who was killed in Syria, in some ways that was the most personal film that I made, because in my docs I'm not in my films, but I really related to her struggle and to what she, and I'm misquoting her here, but one of her famous quotes was, once my copy finally reaches the reader, does anyone care? And it's truly something I think about all the time. Like, did Retrograde make a difference in the world? Did the first wave make a difference in the world? And again, what is that difference? And obviously, I wouldn't keep doing this if I didn't think it did to some degree. But it's interesting how my perception of what making a difference has evolved in my career. When I was in my early 20s, it was right after Inconvenient Truth came out, and I felt like that's how documentaries should be made. It's like that changed the conversation around climate change. It sort of opened people's eyes to a new way of thinking, and so my first feature doc was this film Escape Fire, which is sort of a hybrid essay verite film, and artistically it didn't feel like me, but it felt like what I thought I should be doing, and what I thought documentaries should be. And then Cartel Land was the first film that I made where it was actually felt like it was coming from artistically from a place inside me, and I was following my instincts of what a story should be. And I think, I don't know, so often the way documentaries are funded, the way documentaries are either through nonprofits or equity partners or even studios now, you have to have an impact plan, or what's this film going to do. And I just feel like that's really been an unfortunate way in which a lot of documentaries are made, because it's pigeonholing the art form into one result. Like, a film gets made and we need to push this meter, and I just don't think that art should be. I think it should push many different meters. It should exist in many different forums, and not be about one thing. Going back to City of Ghosts, it's about like 7 different things. On the face, it's about ISIS and journalism. It's about truth, but it's about brotherhood, trauma, all these other things. And I think to be reductionistic is just such an unfortunate thing in documentaries, where I feel like people often feel like they only can and should tell one story, when the human experience is so complicated. And sorry if I'm blabbering, but I mean, one of the more interesting, sorry, this is so afield, but I'll never forget CARTEL LAND screening here in LA. A very passionate group of people came up to me crying, and they were meth addicts. And the opening scene of that movie, and the whole movie as a whole, they'd never thought about the impacts of their choices on other people, let alone another country or another region. And it's just, I never would have ever thought that that would be a reaction from somebody in seeing CARTEL LAND, but it was a really emotional and nuanced reaction to the film. And I don't quite know what I'm saying here, but I hope it's adding up.
Yeah, I mean, it's I always feel, even with features, if it affects one person, then somehow it's been a success. But I don't know. I don't know where it came to me. I shot a film with a couple of friends in Eritrea during the war when they were fighting Ethiopia for independence. So it was like 40 odd years ago. And we thought it was a really good film. We were right on the front lines, but we got in this little village and we decided the film would be about the villagers and their relationship to the EPLF guerrillas who were trying to politicize this feudal village, basically. So it was a fascinating film, I thought. But I always remember one review said, well, they went all the way to Eritrea and we haven't got any battle scenes. And I thought that was so cynical, and that goes like a circular conversation about, do you have to have a dramatic subject to make a documentary, which, I mean, I don't think you do, and Grey Gardens is a point. Now, what I was leading to was,
what
though,
were you leading to?
are the things that you couldn't tackle that you really wanted to? D.A. Pennebaker, again, he said, nobody would let us make Crisis again. I mean, there's certain films that you probably couldn't do. Would that be right?
Yeah, maybe more and more now because it became such a thing also with the streamers and everybody, people started paying their subjects before filming. I mean, I also do that, but I always do it after I film, and it's not an issue. It's not a discussion before the film is finished, so nobody knows. But now I think it became, because documentary became such an exposed thing somehow, with so much discussion going on about the financial side of it and how much money it costs and how much money people get, and that I think it became almost, it's harder now, I think, to approach people. I think that everyone in the meantime would say like, yeah, but what, how much money would I get out of it? And then people start to perform for you.
Yeah.
So I think it did kill, I think, that the development of the last couple of years, destroyed a bit let's say the possibility of an authentic approach to the process.
I think it's partially that, and partially that, everybody, especially younger generations, are so media literate now, and everybody grows up filming themselves and publicizing that footage, that there's the idea that you could kind of melt away and capture something the way that documentaries were created 10, 15 years ago just feels like a nearby past. I think like we're in a different chapter now, where people are very aware of a documentary, where it's going to be released, who it's going to be shown to, the financial side of it, and that changes the types of films that I think we can make.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think a bunch of different thoughts, but I think, for one, I think we're in a sort of scary place in documentaries. You guys telling secrets?
No, I was just reminding him that we also had some questions from people that are watching. But no,
Sorry, Matt.
sorry, Matt. I should have written it and handed it to him, but go ahead. Start again. I'm sorry.
Am I old? Did I say something wrong?
No. Oh, dear.
No, I think honestly, it's part of what scares me and where we are in documentaries is there's this, sort of trend towards funding more. It's sort of what's happening in feature films, IP that people can guarantee there's a return on investment, a subject where they know there's an audience. And, a lot of what we do is a process of discovery. When I'm in a pitch meeting about, First Wave or CARTEL LAND, or, I have no idea what the second or third act is going to be. I can
Right.
tell you that the first act's really interesting. We have really great characters. We're swimming in a petri dish where I think something really interesting can grow, but I cannot guarantee what it's going to be or where it's going to end up. And that to me, more and more, I think funders and studios are less and less inclined to get behind films like that. They're more inclined to get behind celebrity-driven films or films based on a book or based on a news article or based on something else. Obviously, a trend we're seeing in narrative films. So I feel like that's it's sort of a scary place we're at, where I think more investigative, more less clear films are going to be made less and less, especially with younger filmmakers, because people are just less and less likely to take chances these days.
There's a question here, actually, from someone who's listening. How do you fund your documentaries? Is it through grants? Anyone? Alex.
I'll jump in. Sure, yeah. Because I'm just fresh off the first one. It's all very, very recent memory. Yeah, we funded the territory completely independently. And so we wrote hundreds of grant applications. The whole way through production, it was all grants, about $50,000 or less. And I think that independence is what allowed us to do sort of unconventional things, like handing cameras to the participants in the film and bringing them on as co-producers. And, that freedom and flexibility, I don't know that would come on a second film. But for me, that was really important. And then, once we got into the edit and you need to start hiring people, it's not just you and a small team. Then we were able to get some investment, which brought us through the edit. You guys are pros, though. This is just like first timer here. So Alex and Matt, give the real insight.
For me, it's I guess a bit different from you guys because I'm in Europe. So I always work with HBO, for example. They are funding part of the films as a co-producer. Then we have our film funds. So I will do co-productions with other countries where everyone brings a bit from their film funds. And then we have grants. Sundance always supports my films. So we have the Sundance Doc Grant. And yeah, that's basically it. Like, it's a patchwork of financing it.
For me, it's been through my career. It's been a whole host of from GoFundMe's to grants to studios coming in from the beginning. It's been an array. I mean, generally, the last sort of 10 years for me has been a combination of investors and studios. Generally, the way I like to start is I like to actually go out and shoot on my own without any funding, because I'm able to shoot very cheaply and do one or two shoots as a proof of concept to sort of see, is there a film there? Are these subjects as interesting as I think they are? And so, do 2, 3, maybe sometimes 4 shoots, and then cut together like a little sizzle reel, and then use that as a way to get money. That's much how I've done it, with different permutations, but as a general rule of thumb, that's how I've done it, and it found to work. So.
Yeah, I have basically the same system that I go out and shoot with our own money, and then I go pitch the project at ITFA or in front of the industry. So it's always an own investment in the beginning where you want to see, like, should other people risk their money for this? And then you go, once you know that you have something, you edit a sizzle and go out to look for money.
Yeah. So, Raj, you want that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just because.
So, when lighting, are you drawn more to building out the scene to dramatize and enhance for entertainment, or rather shoot as the environment really is for documentary authenticity.
Yeah, because I'd like to mention here a quote from Albert Maysles.
That's why you like this.
If you're concerned with production value, you're part of the Hollywood mindset, no matter how you try to justify it. These things are less important than the content of a movie, and in non-fiction, they're less than the relevant. So does that mean wobbly camera and out-of-focus camera work is justifiable if the subject is worthy? I just kind of want to say this because all your films are visually really very professionally made. And I mean professionally in a good way. Sometimes in the Hollywood sense, that's not good. But, how do you feel?
I'd like to pull out a quote from
All right, we're dueling quotes here.
My quote is from, I don't know if you've heard of it, his name is Roger Deakins. I just looked this up, and he said that really people confuse pretty with good cinematography, which I thought was a very good quote, that, sometimes the messier version of something can actually get at the way that it felt to be there, and being too pretty can trip people up sometimes. And I think that's definitely true for fiction and documentary in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
Alex, you really turned the tables there. I've got no quotes. I mean, I don't ever light anything. So, the part of what I love about making docs this way is you're just, I'm in a hotel room here. You're just thrown in a room and you have to figure out how to make it look interesting. And yeah, I mean, that's you're in, especially like, in the film that Alex and I made together in The First Wave. I mean, we were in really horribly lit hospital rooms, and just trying to find the cinema in these really difficult moments.
But that's partly the point of it, isn't it? It's partly the point of it. These places are horribly lit. They shouldn't have to be, but they are. That's part of the kind of, claustrophobia of the spaces, and that's what you captured really well, because you didn't try and make it look like a Hollywood movie.
Exactly. I mean, it's sort of playing into the environment that you find yourself in, and I feel like, I don't know, we're obviously at a really interesting place too with fiction and nonfiction, where I feel like so many nonfiction films are trying to feel like fiction films. I mean, if you go to Netflix, 80% of their films are, recreation based. And, if you watch the trailer, you're confused, am I watching a narrative film or am I watching a doc? And obviously, narrative films are trying to use documentary techniques. I personally find, a lot of people ask me like, oh, how is your camera steady? And, why isn't it shaky and stuff? Like, I find, unless it's, you're in a bouncy car or something, I find sort of shaky camera work and sort of whip pans and snap zooms and stuff that like people think are part of documentary sort of nomenclature in terms of how you shoot. I find them quite distracting. Like I find them, they draw attention to the camera person as opposed to being in the situation.
Yeah.
So I try to be as sort of move, in a way that doesn't draw attention to the camera work and just makes you feel like you're there in the space.
It really annoys me sometimes when I see a supposedly, authentic feature film or shot in an authentic way with a shaky camera. I think, well, I shot documentaries for 7 years and I don't think my camera work was ever that shaky. I thought I was a better operator than that. So I find it really rude. Alexander, what do you think? Because you're, I mean, tell us what you shoot with and just go into the, you're not light in those spaces, but you're creating very powerful images with what's just in front of you, right?
Yeah, I really believe in available light, and I mean, part of the decision making is also seeing the light and seeing how it falls, and how it's still painting with light, but you just use what is there and understand how to film it, basically. And I think that's also how you do also your narrative work, Roger. I know that you're basically always looking just to, make it look as if it's available light. And so that's one thing. And what Matt says is I can totally subscribe. I do the same. I hate it when the camera moves just for the sake of it. So I always try to be as steady as possible. And I mostly work, with the best that is out there at a certain moment when I start filming the film. I see into it for it not to be too big. I have always a zoom lens so that I can and reach through a room. But I also now my latest experience on someone else's film was I really took an Alexa Mini LF with really great signature prime signature zoom lenses, and so it's a very heavy camera, right? So I had to find a way to make it work the way I work with the cameras normally. So I took the batteries off, put them on a belt around me. I took a cine bag where I could have the camera on, and just trained for a week just to be, to walk as steady as possible with it and just be as, operate it as smoothly as possible. And also do the really classic thing that I do to have the lens in my hand without any focus puller or assistant and really operate the big lenses out of my own hand, the focus. And it works. I think that it's, equipment should integrate to my body somehow, and I should be able to move around and be steady at the same time and not draw attention to myself.
Right. Well, there's another question too: is what does a normal crew comprise of when you're in the field? So you say you don't want to call attention to yourself. How big is your crew?
I mean, inside the set, it's mostly you and the sound man and an assistant somewhere around you that reaches out to production if you need them. Uh, but it also happens, like in Toto, where the room was small, where I would just, with the sound person, we would just, I would have a backpack with the sound equipment or with a recorder and lavaliers on the characters and the boom mic on my camera. So one-man band is not something unusual.
Yeah. What about you guys?
I mean, my favorite position to be in is just completely alone. I love having no
Really?
one around.
Oh, that's funny.
I like people and when I'm not shooting, I like to be around people just for
Oh, okay.
So you're not Gloria Swanson, are you?
no, but I think, to me, being as small and nimble as possible, melting into the background, taking my own sound. I stopped working with sound people, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years ago, just because I felt like it added just another distraction to an already really complicated environment. And so even in films where like I have multiple crews going, like the first wave generally have, we're all kind of one-person bands where we can do everything ourselves, and I find that to be the most effective way of capturing really intimate and honest moments. And for me, in terms of cameras, I use Canon cameras. I don't build them out. To me, I don't understand the point of having a very small camera and then building it out into this big camera. Like I like having a very small body with just the Shep's mic on top, which is amazing, and then at least 2 or 3 lavalier mics, and sound is as important as shooting, obviously, in docs, and capturing good sound is extremely important. So even in really hectic environments, I'm really conscientious of sound. I'm mixing as I'm shooting, as I'm focusing, as I'm framing, and doing all that all at once.
Yeah, and I'm quite similar. I shoot on like a Sony system and generally try to have it be light enough that it's not on my shoulder, and I can kind of move with it in 3 dimensions, begin to turn a corner before, we get to the corner or something like that, and have lav mics running into camera. I think, hopefully if I can get more budget, I would love to have a sound person on with me. More out of necessity on this first project. But I also think, for this, we really didn't want to have a boom or anything on the territory, at least. Felt like that would be too intrusive. But I have heard other people, direct with the boom almost, and if somebody's talking too much in a group circle, all you have to do is point the boom in a different direction, and they kind of know, you're participating in that scene, and they know, all right, maybe this other person's going to have something to say, and so I think, directing through sound can also be an interesting way of operating as well.
Interesting. Here's a question that's kind of interesting. Basically, are there times when you miss situations and events, and how do you deal with situations like that? Oh, Alexander, you have a story. It looked like on your face.
I'm sure we all have. Yeah, I'm sure we all have a lot of. How you deal with? I mean, you try to overcome depression very fast. I mean, it's always.
Well put.
It always happens, and you can't be all the time everywhere and catch things. But I think that there's something that happens in filmmaking which has to do somehow with intention, and things magically start to align. And when you miss things, and you know why you would have liked to have them, or somehow, or many times, they then align or transform into reality in another way. So I think that the way you focus on things and the way you go out with intentions for a shoot, you can watch reality suddenly align. So still, whenever you miss things, that is sort of like that would have been something crucial. It's a hard thing to overcome, and it's really painful. But you have just to learn to let go. I mean, with the years, you learn more to let go.
You don't try and recreate it?
No.
But then you've got to think surely about the things that you did capture. Because I know that just going out with a stills camera, which I do time to time, I mean, I miss a lot, but then I also get things that I love, So
yeah,
you have to look at the positive side.
Yeah, and many times you can create what you thought that certain thing would have said or meant. You can create it out of other things.
Matt, how do you feel?
I mean, I think that's inherently part of documentaries is you're missing stuff all the time. Like you have to, when I was younger, it used to really throw me. I used to get, I think you said depression, right? Getting over depression. I used to get so in my head and just like so upset. Oh my God, this film is ruined. I missed this moment. And like, you're missing moments all the time, every day that you don't even know that you're missing. And so I think the key is A, getting over it quickly, and B, figuring out how to readjust. And you're also getting doors shut in your face constantly, and it's about figuring out how to open those doors and push through. And a big example from the film I just made, Retrograde, about the end of the war in Afghanistan, was we'd spent 8 months building towards the end of the war, and basically we thought we were going to go back and film with this general that we'd spent months with in this sort of final battle between the Afghan army and the Taliban. And we flew to Dubai. The country started to fall quite rapidly, and then we got on a plane to Kabul. And basically, as we descended into the valley of Kabul, the pilot got on the intercom and said, we can't land. There's a plane on the tarmac. And we were so low that all of our phones started to ping. And we got these news alerts that the Taliban had taken over the country and taken over Kabul, and that the plane on the tarmac was actually President Ghani fleeing. And so the pilot circled and circled and circled and was too scared to land. And we went back to Dubai. And I literally thought it was the greatest failure of my entire career. We had spent 8 months building to this moment. Our main character was sitting there right in the center of this story, this huge international news story. We had everything building to that moment, and I was sitting there watching it play out on a hotel TV screen hundreds of miles away, and just hating myself, so much self-loathing, and spent every waking hour trying to figure out how to sneak back into the country, which we did 5 days later. And going back to the Al Mazo's quote, if you end up with the story you started with and you weren't listening along the way, that happened for a reason. but the key is figuring out what that reason is. If I'd landed, I would have stayed with General Sadat, and I would have seen a very small view of this tragic final moment. But what ended up happening was I went back, and with every door that closes, a door opens. With every failure comes an opportunity, and the opportunity that this gave us was to see the civilians that General Sadat had been fighting for, to see the civilians that the Americans had been fighting for. And it just really changed the film. The whole final act of the film became something quite emotional and quite different. And so just about immediately readjusting to this new reality. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the key is just once you have these failures, once you miss these moments, it's adjusting and understanding what else you can do and what other opportunities you can take advantage of.
Alex, for you, it must have been particularly interesting because you were filming over years, right, for Territory.
Yeah.
So every
we
time you
filmed-
went away, did you miss something?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and I think, that it's something I've always sort of had socially is FOMO. I don't know if that's a term in
Yeah.
Europe, but the fear of missing out. And I
Yeah.
think that is a thing to be controlled and not let it take over, your entire way you're approaching the film. But it's good to feel a little anxious about missing something in order to stay a little long, to have those 18-hour days and not say, okay, we got what we came here for, we're out. And so, yeah, it's a push-pull with that. But a lot of documentary is just repetition too, and things that happen cyclically. And so, being able to get it once, being able to get it twice, getting it from a different angle, never asking to recreate something, but being able to anticipate how something might happen, so that you can be set up for the shot beforehand or whatever it is. And if it's something totally, that never happens twice, like the fall of Kabul, then I think it's just a antidepressant strategy.
There's a
It's funny
go
you say
ahead.
that, because I think we all documentary filmmakers have some horrible case of FOMO. I think that's part of what drives us.
That's
Yeah.
funny. There's someone that's asking, have you seen The Act of Killing? Which I haven't, so I don't know, by Joshua Oppenheimer. And they talking about truth. Tell us what this question means. Oh,
Yeah, I don't want to talk about it myself, but I have in the past. It makes me a little angry. Sorry. Who wants to talk about that?
Roger,
Yeah.
you can't say that. You gotta finish the sentence.
No.
At least with a quote.
Does somebody else want to respond to this?
I don't get the question. I mean, if you've I've seen it.
The film's kind of controversial, isn't it?
Why?
For
I've
many
never
reasons.
seen it, so
I don't know the controversy around it.
yeah.
Okay.
I quite liked it, so I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong
reenacting
thing.
basically the
Yeah.
things
He's
the
reenacting
general.
genocidal acts. Sorry.
No.
No, go on.
No. I mean, I think it was a very controversial film when it came out, because he used the perpetrators of crimes to reenact their genocidal acts, and in an effort to sort of But I guess we're not here to debate what the film's about.
It's just that.
No, I think it's and we could we've talked about that, really, the nature of reconstructing something instead of capturing something when it's really happening, and trying to pretend you're showing a documentary when it's really a reenaction of something, which is a personal point of view, can only ever be a personal point of view. I find that a bit difficult myself.
Okay. Very good. Here's a UC Berkeley doc grad student who wanted to know what advice you all have about doing it all, editing, directing, etc., which is what I want to do, versus being a specialist in one aspect.
I mean, I think that's the beauty of where, 20, 30 years ago in docs, there were lanes, you're the editor, you're the cinematographer, you're the sound person. I think more and more, people are, both because of the democratization of technology and the access to it, you're able to sort of do it all. And so to me, there's great value, even if you do want to just direct and not ever shoot, or you do want to just edit and not ever direct or shoot. I think there's great value in trying to at least experience all those things so you can better understand how to be, even if you just want to be one of them. But for me, as someone who edits, shoots, directs, produces, it's really inherently part of what I do. As I shoot, I'm editing. As I edit, I'm thinking about what it felt like when I was shooting. Obviously we're all forced to produce based on the types of films we make. So I think it's really important to at least have experience in doing all of them.
I think it's also, for me, it's been a helpful, just moving into becoming a working director. I kind of moved into it from cinematography. And so I think, even if you are going to sample, I like to edit, I like to do all these different things. But for me, just within the scope of the industry and practically speaking, it was helpful for me to have one thing that I really identified as, which was a cinematographer, and I could get work for that. In addition to directing and trying to learn all these different aspects. And I think there is, a bit of a risk, I think, if you become too much of a multi-hyphenate, that nobody looks at you as the most serious contender for any one particular position, because you sort of present as a very broad set of skills, which can be great if you're doing, your own personal projects. But when you're looking to be part of somebody else's, it's got a cost benefit.
Yeah, I subscribe to those.
Okay.
Okay.
The Alexander stamp of approval.
That was I'm quoting. I was only quote from both of them.
So here's one. Have you ever had a documentary so powerful you felt urged to pursue into a larger filmic narrative or revisit the topic?
No, I mean it's hard. I mean, revisiting I find it hard to revisit topics because I always, I mean, you're so invested in something when you're doing it for years, most of the times, and I kind of hope that I gave it everything and I, sucked out the juice out of it and you know transformed it into the best cinematic version of it. So it's hard to think about recycling it basically.
I feel the same way. Like, for me, these are deep, deep, deep emotional experiences, and I think part of it's such a privilege to do what we do. It's such a commitment to do what we do, and that's part of what I love is every 2 or 3 years diving into a new pond and exploring a new world. And so, people constantly, are you going to go back and do CARTEL LAND 2? Or are you going to go back and for me, like, I feel like I did that, and I want to keep exploring new places and new worlds, and yeah.
I would think too that trying to make it a narrative would require so much compromise because you had you had documented a true character and true events that probably were pretty incredible, and then you get into the system and they want a certain actor for that role, but you've got to change it for the strength of that actor. So in a way, if you felt very strongly about your documentary, that would be a really hard thing to do, I would think.
I think it's also hard, the relationship that you have with the people in your film. Like, I would have no problem with somebody else making the fiction version of the
Mm-hmm.
territory if it was the right person and, everything else came around to work. But I would never want to do it. And I think part of that is that I have this unique and particular relationship with the community in the film forged through, the crucible of production. And we already have talked about how, like, you edit somebody and they might not even recognize parts of the character that they're seeing on screen, for better or worse. Maybe you saw something true that they hadn't even recognized in themselves yet, or the editing had created a simplified version of events that didn't feel exactly like the way that they experienced it in the moment. And I think that just gets extrapolated out, 10 steps further when you get to a fiction script. And so if you are then also accountable to that community for all of the decisions that get made in the fictionalization of it, I think you'd enter into some really tricky territory, just interpersonally, I think.
That's a good
I'm
point.
wondering if is there an example of a really good documentary that became a really good narrative piece?
I was trying to think as you were talking.
Yeah.
I can't. I can't really think of one.
Maybe there's a reason for this then.
Only documentaries that were more narrative than documentary. Man of Aaron. Anyway.
Then one other question here. How do you find your next interesting doc idea? Are you always researching for something new, or do you let it come to you? Or does it come to you? I mean, does it, without trying, come to you?
For me,
I think that.
you know,
Okay, no, you're
go
good.
ahead,
You're
Alex.
good. No, no, you go.
Go ahead, Matt.
The
Go
continental
ahead.
delay. For me, for me, the stories always find me. Like I think we're all fortunate, where I'm sure we're getting approached about different films from different people, and I've certainly had a lot of people approach me about a lot of different films. I've never actually really made anyone else's, another idea that came to me. It's always come from me because these are such deep personal, expeditions, and you really have to care. And so, for me, it's never come externally. It's always come from something I've read or something I've experienced, or, and I think, and generally, if I look back on all my films, it's trying to take issues that are sort of in the headlines and trying to humanize them in some way. Drug war in Mexico, ISIS in Syria, COVID, end of the war in Afghanistan. I think I've if there's one through line in my work, it's trying to humanize these deeply complex issues. And so, yeah.
Alexander?
I have a very similar experience, but yeah, the stories always crossed my path, and it was always in a moment of. I always had to be in a moment where I would just have no expectations about anything. I wouldn't know what to do next, but I wouldn't also not push it. And then suddenly, it's strange, One time it was just I just stood up and felt I have to get my coat on and walk a certain street down, and someone came to me and asked me if I want to take a look at something. Like this strange things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I mean, for sure, with collective, it was it was such a big thing that first I started filming a bit on the street, but sort of like, no, that's really too big. I mean, it's impossible to show anything in a doc. Where would you start to try to understand this whole societal thing that is going on, a whole
Mm-hmm.
turmoil that was started by a fire? And then I went to Afghanistan, DPing on a French film in Afghanistan. And then when I came back, I landed in Berlin for the European Film Awards with my last film, and was in the car with my good friend and producer at HBO, and she said, like, no, you should pursue that. I mean, try to look into it. There must be a way to do something on the collective thing, right? And so I flew back to Bucharest and then jumped with my team into it. Um, but mostly it is, yeah, I think that it's just keeping your antennas out and then see what, where you are suddenly sucked into something that you can't get out of it.
Alex?
Yeah.
I think for me, I've only made one film, so there's no pattern to be drawn from any of this. But when I think about the next project, there's a lot of ideas that I have that I would have been very excited to incorporate into the territory, that I tried really hard to build in, but that just didn't fit with the story that we had. The script that was written by the lives of these people. And so those ideas still remain. And I think I'm, in analyzing potential future projects, I'm looking for, in some ways, a vessel for these ideas that I have about the world or the things that I want to say, and looking for situations that I think might be able to carry that in a dramatic way over the next year or two or whatever it is. But it's basically all the leftovers from the territory. How do we put that into a new bucket, and take that in a new direction?
Yeah, true.
Okay.
I knew he had a quote.
Fred Wiseman. Documentary filmmaking ruins you for life because you learn to be extremely attentive.
That's a great quote.
I think that's a great quote. It is. I kind of feel that myself as somebody that's obsessed about images and looking at things and exploring.
You can also say that about script supervision. But
Yeah,
okay.
right. How do you guys feel about that? Matt, you can do that again.
I like this little skit we have going here. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I think there's probably a reason we all do what we do, and it's in the DNA makeup to be willing to sit and shoot for 18 hours a day, or sit in an edit room for 9 months and analyze images. And we're probably all have some version of OCD in terms of our attention to detail. And
Do you find yourself sitting in a room with friends and exploring where you would put the camera? You know what I mean? How you break it down, which part of the conversation, which part of the conversation will stay in this scene. You know what I mean? I do.
How would you do it now with James in the room?
Oh, no, that gets a bit personal, doesn't it? No, come on. Anyway, it's you guys that are talking, not me.
I mean, I find that I work so much that when I'm not working, I really try to turn my brain off. Is the honest thing.
Yeah.
Maybe you could teach that to us and me and Roger.
Well, I do. I mean, I love taking still photographs, but I have to make a moment a day I'm going to do that, so the rest of life is try and be free from that world. Yeah, Alexander, how do you feel?
Have you been ruined?
It's a strange thing. Yeah, it's a strange thing because it definitely happens when I'm shooting and when I start thinking about a film, or when I come off a film. Like right now, when I was shooting for 2 weeks, I come back and the next 2 weeks, it's just like, I really see. And I also start seeing the city different, and I start seeing rooms different, and I start seeing again faces different. So, but as Matt, I think that then I really have a point where I switch off and I'm the most unaware person, basically. And I also discovered that, seeing the world through a lens, I think it also was for many, many years also a kind of coping mechanism for me. I discovered an ADD very late. And I discovered it only through this super focused attention through a lens. I basically, over the years, managed my ADD. And it was, it's a bit like meditation, right? You get your gear and the lens, and then you just start to take the world apart through the lens.
I used to find it kind of wonderful shooting documentaries, or making a couple with a friend. It was almost an escape from the rest of the world in a way. And and it's on feature films, isn't it? Really, you're with so many people, so many friends. It's very strange when you stop. That's another thing. After a long time on a feature film, you're kind of living in a particular little bubble, and then you stop, and
The world
it's
is
very
different.
strange. Yeah.
And
Alex,
have you been ruined, Alex?
have you been ruined yet?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way as you. You know, I take still photographs and love taking still photographs, both like for the act of doing it, but also to have them afterwards. It's funny, I have it right next to me, but I have this little camcorder that I just bought to just document like everyday life as it's happening. And I find like if the more I'm doing it, the more the less space it takes up in my brain, and you know, maybe that's its own sort of compulsion that should be dealt with by a therapist. But you know, I don't think a ton about the framing choices as I'm shooting with this little camcorder. I'm just shooting really, really freely and really openly, and I'm not shooting to edit either. I'm shooting just to have it. And
Is that
yeah,
more?
I don't know.
Is that more truthful? That's kind of interesting. Is that more truthful?
Maybe, you know, the idea that I'm not going to be editing this and I'm not going to be showing it to anybody in the foreseeable future. This is not for publication. It certainly allows me to be more open. And I think it's the reason that a little camcorder like this for me is better than shooting with a cell phone, because people know when they see this, I can't just click, you know, upload to Instagram or whatever. And so they are, you know, more open, I think, given the knowledge that this isn't live streaming or something like that. But I think paying attention is a good thing. And, you know, paying certain types of attention is especially important. You know, training yourself to see things differently, I think is a really good thing. And whether that's visually or, you know, ideologically, the way that we live our lives, I would disagree that learning to pay attention could ruin you somehow.
Okay, we should get you together with Fred Wiseman.
Yeah.
So, Roger, do you have any more quotes?
I got plenty, but I think, you know, come
I
on,
think
you
we've
know.
done it. Yeah.
It's just very interesting, sort of
Yeah.
delving into what other filmmakers have said about their approach. It's interesting.
Well,
I
thank
actually-
you guys. Oh, go ahead. No, go on,
No,
Matt.
What Alex was saying, I actually feel like I learned. This wasn't the question or the quote, but I find a lot of my like analysis or learning comes from watching other people's films. Like I'm constantly sort of, you know, what would I do if I was in that situation? How would I, you know, do I admire what they did? Do I, you know, I love watching other people's films and trying to sort of put myself in that place. And I feel like that's often so lost in the critique or understanding of film is not understanding the construct in which the person was in which they were making the film. You know, it's often sort of just on the topic or the, you know, not based on the actual like goal or what that filmmaker set out to do. So I love watching film, and I love watching docs, and I love just sort of trying to learn and analyze as I do so. And I feel like that's
interesting.
really-
So many of them are struggling with the same ideas we've been talking about the approach and how much you recognize your appearance in the film. You know, I say like with Dave Hancock and Herb DeJoya, they were kind of really playing with that. Or then the extreme is, you know, I mean, you know, the films of John Rush or the McDougalls in Africa, and you know, the different kinds of documentaries where people were still playing with the medium and trying to find out what really is truth, you know.
But you know, that conversation, obviously I've learned so much from you, and you know, I love watching narrative films too. And you know, the conversation that we had many years ago about, you know, CARTEL LAND versus Sicario, like I felt like I learned so much even in just that discussion we had. So we're so fortunate to be able to do what we do and to be able to tell stories. And I feel very lucky.
My word, yeah. Don't take so many dangerous situations, Matt. I can't. Too many people worry about you.
Well, great. This is good.
Great.
You good?
Great. Are you good? Anything?
Yeah.
We missed a lot, I know, but it was kind of good, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very good.
I loved
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
It was lovely seeing you and
Yeah.
three of you talking together. That was really great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to put up the end card. Hang on.